Welcome back to the channel. So I've been tagged a number of times on Twitter and YouTube and various other places that people are still talking about the UK trial and comparing it to the Virginia trial for Amber Heard and Johnny Depp. So I thought I'd do a very brief recap on some of the main differences, and for those that are a bit or a lot late to the party, why the UK trial should not be used to bolster views that Amber Heard was right, Johnny Depp was wrong, as many people seem to do. First of all, most notably, that the UK trial was not against Amber Heard. She was not a party to the trial, at least not one of the parties within the claim. She did provide evidence, some of which was at her choice and when she chose to do so, and that was as noted by the judge in the UK trial. But the UK trial was not against Amber Heard. She was not a party to it. She was not obliged to disclose material in the same way that the actual parties and defendants to the case were. In a normal trial, if you are one of the parties, you go through what we call a disclosure process, and what in the US you call a discovery process, whereby you have a duty to disclose any information which might be pertinent to or against your case. So if you are the defendant, anything that might be in support of your defense but also that might go against you, you are under a duty to disclose this information. Now, why is that important? Well, because for the UK trial, Amber Heard was not subject to those same disclosure rules. That was noted by the judge in the UK judgment. And so comparing the two is just a bit silly, really, because the case against Amber Heard in the US was obviously against her. She was a party, and it was a full-blown trial with a jury. In the UK, not so. What is interesting, however, in the UK trial was all of the issues of credibility that I raised and discussed at great length, some of which I will link in the description below. But just so that you can draw some views, if you are caught in this sort of late to the party crowd and being told that the UK trial XYZ, let's recap some of the credibility issues that I went over from the UK trial, from the lower court judgment in the UK. Judgment by Mr. Justice Nicol. Now, I'm not going to make comments as to what I think about those. I've done that extensively in previous videos. I'll link those in the description below. You can go and look at those. What I'm going to do instead is give you the headlines for these credibility issues, we'll call them. And in fact, they were referred to as challenges to the credibility of Miss Heard's independent or particular allegations of abuse. So let's look at some of those, and I'll pull up that judgment now. This is the very title here: the claimant's challenge to the credibility of Miss Heard's independent of particular allegations of abuse. The first one, alleged lie to the Department of Homeland Security regarding the status of Savannah McMillan. Now, this was an issue whereby she was saying that she was not working unlawfully for her, and apparently wrote a letter to Homeland Security. Now, there's a couple of interesting things that came out of this, one of which was as to who wrote it. Now, Amber Heard had said that it was Savannah McMillan that wrote this letter. But as you can see further down, one of the arguments brought up, it's referred to here as a subsidiary issue, ventilated at trial, discussed, argued at trial, was whether Savannah had drafted the letter herself, as Ms. Heard had said in her evidence. Mr. Sherborne, in his closing speech, observed that the letter contained two different spellings of her surname: McMillan, i.e. the M in the middle here with a lowercase m in the second paragraph, and McMillan with a capitalized M. Now, what I will say is you can draw your own judgment as to whether this was your name with a capitalized M in the middle. I have a surname which has two capital letters in it, and I get very fussy when people use a lowercase s in the middle of my surname of Shensmith. So I would think that anyone writing a letter, if it were them that was writing this letter, that they would write their name correctly, as in they would capitalize the M, and you can see it here. So it's a capitalized M here, and you can see somewhere else, whereas up here you can see it's with a lowercase m. All of this surrounded the credibility of Amber writing a letter to Homeland Security and whether or not that was a lie. This was just one of the challenges to her credibility raised in this trial. Let's move to the next one. And as I said, you can draw your own judgments as to each of these as we go along, some of which are still sort of prevalent and in the news. The second one here, the conviction in Australia for knowingly making a false declaration regarding the importation of dogs in Australia. Now, this was something that she'd pleaded guilty to, and anyone that has looked at the news for this will know that there is an ongoing perjury trial in Australia for this very event of illegally importing these dogs into Australia. Now, the ongoing investigation surrounds whether she was convincing somebody to give false evidence on her behalf. And so this was yet another limb of attack on her credibility. Again, you can draw your own conclusions as to that one. The third one, the allegation that Miss Heard sought to procure false evidence by Kevin Murphy and Kate James for the purpose of the criminal proceedings in Australia, the one that we referred to just above. And the key point here was an email written by Amber Heard to Carl Martin and Marty Singer, in the course of which she wrote, "The only thing we are missing is evidence that the process being initiated, however not completed, and therefore the dogs weren't taking, as it was written, on the trip. That's obviously harder to prove since it involves documenting something that didn't happen." Now again, this is a challenge upon her credibility, which you can draw your own conclusions. And it goes on here. Kevin, do you think you could get her to do it? Could possibly reach out for us? Again, pushing as to whether or not that statement would be made. Now, the judge, as I discussed at great length in my previous videos, said that because there was no evidence that she was ever asked to sign an untruthful statement, the conclusion was that it didn't go against her credibility. But again, you can draw your own conclusions about that. But let's move down to another one here. Allegation that Miss Heard tried to grease a vet to procure necessary travel documentation for the dogs. Obviously, to travel, the dogs needed to have certain veterinary tests and so on. Can you maybe help Kevin procure a slightly altered health doc that has their shots recorded 2 days before so they can all leave together? Do we have a vet we could grease? Connection? ? Again, this is an attack on the credibility, and again, I'll leave you to judge what you think about it. That's number 4. Let's move down to number 5. The growth in number and seriousness of the allegations of domestic against Ms. Heard. Now, the importance of this one, which I will link this judgment, if I remember, in the description below, or you can find it online. The importance about this one is consistency. So any case that comes to court needs to be consistent to really be believable. In other words, it's not exaggerated, it doesn't change, it doesn't get more extravagant and more outrageous as time goes on. If it does, it tends to be less credible, and hence why that was an attack on credibility here. That's number 5. Again, you can draw your own conclusions. Number 6. Miss Heard's enthusiasm to meet with Mr. Depp in 2016 despite the restraining order. Now, the crux of this is, if you have a restraining order against somebody because you don't want to be around them, why would you be enthusiastic about meeting them? That's essentially what this one is about. So attacking the credibility of whether this was all sort of genuine fear, genuine need for a restraining order, and so on and so forth, if you've got enthusiasm to go and meet said person. Number 7. Miss Heard's admission to violence in recorded conversations contrasted with her evidence in which she denied being the violent party. Most people by now have heard those audio recordings. In fact, one of the main reasons that I've said that I talk about this case is because this case was made public for people to talk about, comment on, and so on and so forth. Most cases like this are not ever made public. I've been involved in lots of cases where there's lots of audio recordings such as this. I've heard quite horrific audio recordings where people have been locked in the bathroom, for example, people threatening to do things to themselves or to others or even to the children. And there are hours worth of conversations recorded in audio which entirely contradict the evidence that a party is given in court. The judge in those cases that I've been involved with invariably will listen to those recordings with a certain degree of, skepticism and pinch of salt here and there as to what's been heard, because many times that they are pre-recorded for a reason to entrap somebody and so on. But generally, the contents of those recordings are taken to be credible because it's a contemporaneous instant recording of exactly what happened, what was said at that time, at that place. It captures the emotions, it captures the words, it captures the frame of mind, and so on. So in this case, the challenge to the credibility was the admissions of violence in the recorded conversations as against the evidence that she gave in court. That's the crux of challenge to credibility number 7. Number 8, Miss Heard's invention of the monster in an attempt to portray Johnny Depp as a Jekyll and Hyde character. Now, ultimately, this was submitted that this was created by her rather than by him. And if you watched any or most of the Virginia trial, you will have heard about this monster discussed all the way through and actually being referred to as other things, i.e. Relationship with alcohol and so on and so forth. And then the judgment goes on to discuss Johnny Depp's record or non-record for violence, and we've discussed that in great detail in other videos. So those I wanted to recap are the challenges to credibility. Why is that so important? Because if a case comes to court and there is a challenge to credibility, then ultimately the judge might make a finding that that witness just wasn't credible. It's as simple as that. And if the witness wasn't credible, then their case is not generally to be believed. The other one that I haven't touched on here is obviously the argument about the donation, the pledge, the money that was or was not donated to charity, which later in the Virginia trial was made very clear that this money wasn't given over. It was just a pledge, promise to pay. And I've covered the wording and where I think the wording came from, because the document referred to it as a pledge, and that's where I think the wording came from, which if it was just a pledge, just a promise, fine. Say it's just a pledge and just a promise. Don't say it's actually been paid if it hasn't actually been paid. I believe that the judge in this UK trial had not taken that so seriously, because a judge is not going to be quick to strike somebody down as to their credibility just because someone's saying that they haven't actually paid something over, and it wasn't a central issue to the case anyway. So I make no criticism of the judge for not doing that, but of course it later transpires that this wasn't paid across. It was made quite clear by the lawyers and in the cross-examination that this money was not, in fact, paid across. So why now bring this back up to attention? Well, because lots of people, as I said, have tagged me to discuss the UK trial again, because it's being used as a sort of bolster for the whole comparison between the UK trial and the Virginia trial. Now, here's a thought, which I haven't really said before, but cases that are decided in a civil trial are decided on the balance of probabilities. It's not a criminal trial. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not, as we say, so the jury are sure. It's on the balance of probabilities. So here's an idea that I'll leave you with, and I'd like your thoughts in the comments below. By the way, apologies if the audio has been rubbish. I've just noticed that the bar is going far too high. I'll need to turn that down. I've updated the software, so I will fix that next time. However, civil trials are decided on the balance of probabilities. So here's a thought, and I want your comments in the box below, please. If now there's been a jury trial where Amber Heard was the actual opponent, not just the effective opponent as it was argued in the UK trial, but the actual opponent in the Virginia trial, she was the defendant. The jury found in Johnny Depp's favour entirely on his claim and in small part on her claim. That being the case, they did not believe the crux of the findings of the UK trial, i.e. that Johnny Depp did those things. The jury did not believe those things, and it was a jury deciding these. On the balance of probabilities, it should be the case that this UK trial, this UK verdict, could be overturned, looked at again, or even discarded on the basis of the jury's verdict. There's an idea. It's just an idea on the balance of probabilities, because it's a civil trial. That's how civil decisions are made. So on the balance of probabilities, I proffer that to you, and your thoughts and comments in the box below, please. With that, I bid you a lovely day. It's very sunny here. You can see the sun coming through onto my face. I hope you enjoyed that overview, given you some food for thought. And as always, thank you so much for watching.